Welcome back to the VybeShift Podcast. This week we've been exploring a challenge that affects far more people than most of us realize. Not because it's rare, but because it has become normal. We've been talking about what happens when life begins pulling us in too many directions at once. Work demands, family demands, financial demands, health demands, personal growth demands, dreams we haven't given up on, responsibilities we can't abandon, expectations we feel obligated to fulfill. And somewhere inside all of that, a small voice keeps whispering, I can't keep doing all of this. Yet most people never stop long enough to ask an important question. What exactly is creating the pressure? Because the obvious answer isn't always the real answer. Most of us assume we're overwhelmed because we have too much on our plate. Sometimes that's true, but often something deeper is happening. What exhausts us isn't merely the number of responsibilities we carry, it's the number of identities we are trying to protect simultaneously. Think about that for a moment. Most of us aren't simply trying to manage our schedules, we're trying to manage multiple versions of ourselves. The successful professional, the devoted partner, the attentive parent, the supportive friend, the healthy person, the financially responsible person, the ambitious dreamer, the spiritual seeker, the person who never lets anyone down, the person who always has it together, the person who remains productive, the person who remains relevant, the person who remains admired, the person who remains needed. And eventually, those identities begin competing with one another. Not because any of them are bad, but because there are only 24 hours in a day. Only so much energy. Only so much emotional bandwidth. Only one life. And eventually something starts breaking. Many people assume what's breaking is their discipline. But often what's breaking is an unsustainable arrangement. The arrangement where every version of ourselves gets equal voting rights. The arrangement where every obligation receives equal importance. The arrangement where every possibility remains open. The arrangement where every possibility remains open. The arrangement where we refuse to disappoint anyone, including ourselves. And that creates a tremendous amount of suffering. Because life eventually forces choices. Not because life is cruel, but because reality requires commitment. The future you want always demands that something else be released. This is where many people get stuck. They keep trying to add another system, add another planner, add another strategy, add another productivity hack, add another habit, add another goal, add another commitment. But what if the next chapter of your life isn't asking you to add anything? What if it's asking you to subtract? What if your exhaustion isn't a signal that you need more capacity? What if it is a signal that you're exceeding healthy capacity? That possibility can be difficult to hear, especially for people who are driven, people who care, people who are capable, people who have spent their entire lives proving they can carry more. But eventually there comes a moment where strength begins to look different. When we were younger, strength often means carrying more. As we mature, strength often means carrying less, not because we become weaker, because we become wiser. We've learned that every yes costs something. Every commitment costs something. Every obligation costs something. Every identity costs something. And if we are not careful, we end up spending our entire lives serving structures that no longer serve us. I think many people find themselves here right now, not because they're failing, but because they're evolving. Their old operating system no longer fits. The priorities that once worked no longer work. The identity that once protected them now confines them. The strategies that once produced success now produce exhaustion. And because the old system is familiar, They assume they need to work harder inside of it, instead of realizing that they need a different system entirely. This is why clarity often arises disguised as frustration, or burnout, or confusion, or fatigue. Those experiences are frequently invitations, not punishments. Life asking us to pause, to reevaluate, to examine what we've been carrying, to determine what still belongs and what doesn't. One of the hardest truths I've had to learn is this: every meaningful chapter of growth requires a death. Not a physical death, an identity death, a belief death, an expectation death, a role death, a version of yourself death. The person you are becoming requires space, and space cannot be created without release. That's why the life you want often cannot fit inside the life you are trying to maintain. Something has to give. Something has to evolve. Something has to be released. The question becomes, what? Most people immediately start looking at their calendar, but I would encourage you to look somewhere else first. Look at your internal commitments. Look at the promises you've made to yourself. Look at the identities you're protecting. Look at the stories you're maintaining. Look at the expectations you're carrying, because often the heaviest burdens are invisible. The need to prove yourself, the need to justify ourselves, the need to be enough, the need to keep everyone happy, the need to avoid disappointment, the need to maintain an image. Those burdens consume enormous energy, and because they're internal, we rarely question them. We simply assume they're part of life. But what if they're not? What if some of them have simply outlived their usefulness? What if they were never meant to be permanent? What if the next chapter of your life requires less proving and more trusting? Less performing and more being? Less striving and more alignment? I think most people are far closer to clarity than they realize. Not because they have all the answers, but because they can already feel what no longer fits. That's usually where wisdom begins. Not by knowing exactly what to do, but by recognizing what is no longer true. What is no longer sustainable. What is no longer aligned. And from that recognition comes choice, a powerful choice. The choice to stop trying to carry every version of yourself into the future. The choice to stop negotiating with every compelling demand. The choice to stop believing that your value is determined by how much you can carry, because your worth was never dependent upon your exhaustion. Your value was never dependent upon your sacrifice. Your significance was never dependent upon your ability to hold everything together. You were enough long before you became overwhelmed, and perhaps that's where this week's journey ultimately leads us. Not toward a better system, not toward greater productivity, not toward becoming more efficient at carrying impossible loads, but toward remembering something simple. You only get one life, one mind, one body, one nervous system, one precious existence. And the goal is not to spend that existence being pulled apart. The goal is to bring it together, to become integrated, aligned, whole, to live from the center that is no longer being dragged into a dozen directions. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. Life doesn't necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer, and clarity changes everything. Thank you for joining me this week. Until next time, keep shifting, because the power you have been looking for may not be found in doing more. It may be found in finally releasing what no longer belongs. Continue the journey on the Vibrational Stage podcast. This week's VybeShift podcast has explored what happens when life begins pulling us in too many directions at once. We've examined the external demands, competing priorities, and hidden costs of trying to maintain every commitment, every opportunity, and every version of ourselves simultaneously. But there's a deeper question still waiting to be explored. Why do we keep doing this? Why do intelligent, capable, accomplished people continue carrying identities, expectations, and obligations that are quietly exhausting them? The Vibrational Stage Podcast Preview. The person I am trying to be is exhausting me. Most exhaustion isn't physical. Most exhaustion comes from carrying a version of ourselves that no longer fits. The professional image, the responsible one, the strong one, the person who never struggles, the person who never disappoints anyone, the person who keeps proving their worth over and over again. In this week's Vibrational Stage Podcast, we move beyond productivity, priorities, and competing demands to explore the deeper emotional reality underneath them. The exhausting relationship we often develop with the person we believe we need to become. If you've ever felt like you're working harder than ever and somehow feeling less like yourself in the process, this episode was created for you. The difference between the two shows. The VybeShift Podcast helps you understand the problem. The Vibrational Stage Podcast helps you experience the deeper truth underneath the problem. VybeShift focuses on awareness, insight, and practical understanding. Vibrational Stage explores identity, emotion, meaning, and the human experience behind what you're facing. Together, they create a complete journey for recognition to transformation. If today's episode resonated with you, you can continue the journey on the Vibrational Stage Podcast. You can follow the link in the show notes. Because sometimes the greatest source of exhaustion isn't everything you're doing. Sometimes it's the person you're trying so hard to be.